Okay, warm welcome to Mugdha Barave. She's a sports psychologist practicing in the field for 20 years. She runs a clinic in Bombay and she also has an organization called Mind Sports. The interesting thing is that she works with a wide variety of psychology, including clinical psychology, and pretty much probably the most experienced psychologist, and she specializes in sports psychology. Most ignored part of sports, but I think she says that it's picking up and catching up these days in many ways. But 20 years of experience is something that I think sailing and yachting, we need to work with it, because I've seen very little sports psychology being deployed in our sport of sailing. I'm sure some of the top sailors at the Olympic level, at the Asian Games level, have sports psychologists, but I think we ought to make this more and more an integrated part of our sport. Mugdha has been an international level swimmer. She's won prestigious state level awards and also the Chhatrapati Award in swimming. She's been associated with many sports, which makes her, her experience very diverse. Mumbai Cricket Association, Olympic Gold Quest, and the Exercise Science Academy. She was also associated as a sports psychologist with the Vidarbha Cricket Association of Bengal, and the JSW Sports. She's been training several elite athletes across all sports, such as archery, shooting, wrestling, weightlifting, boxing, chess, table tennis, etc. And for prestigious international events like the Olympics, Asian Games, World Championships, Premier Leagues, etc. I think we cannot find in India anything or anybody better than Mugdha. Warm welcome to you, Mugdha. And I hand over the mic to you. Thanks very, very
much. Thank you very much for this introduction of mine. And I'm really happy to be here and talk to all the sailors, because I'm sure, as you said, that not many of the sailors are maybe either aware or taking advantage of this kind of mental training or sports psychology. So I think through today's talk, what I have planned to do is maybe a little bit of an awareness program, and also touching upon certain things that are important when it comes to mental training. So I'm sure, I think once even the athletes are aware of it, the awareness is going to increase, and maybe hopefully they will start taking advantage of this field especially. So yeah, I'll start with my presentation. Yes, so today, yeah, I'm going to talk about basically what is mental toughness. What I've tried doing is today's presentation, I've tried separating it or dividing it into 4 segments. So the first one, I will be explaining what mental toughness is, because I think there is where we usually, athletes as well as parents and coaches, face kind of a question mark as to what do we mean by mental toughness. The second one is what are the parameters that we can touch upon or that can be covered under mental toughness or mental training. Different types of mental training techniques. I'm sure we have limited time today, so I'm sure I'll not be able to cover all of the techniques which are really beneficial for the athletes. But yes, I'm going to try my level best and cover at least the most important ones which athletes can start using. And the last section, where I will just again touching upon from the coach's perspective, what kind of care or what kind of awareness that even the coaches need to have when it comes to mental training approach. So let's start with what is mental toughness first of all. And since I work with many athletes and fortunately carrying this kind of experience for last so many years, I usually prefer, or I like the way of starting it with stories, because yes, I know, I'm sure all of you all are also aware what mental toughness is, because we talk about motivation, we talk about self-confidence, we talk about concentration, focus. So we know all these terms when it comes to mental toughness. But I want to just explain this term by talking about or telling you all a story. And it's a real story. Maybe later on also you all can just go on to the Google and listen to this TED talk of an ocean swimmer whose name is Mr. Lewis. He is basically a person who has spent, I think, 26 years into swimming, and he's into ocean swimming, marathon swimming, and he does these symbolic swims. And one of the main reasons why I want to talk about him and explain or give it a kind of a story for you all is because I think all of the aspects which we will be talking about mental toughness are getting covered in his experience that he's talking about. So just to cut the story short, he planned, I think that was 5 to 6 years back. He is an environmentalist and want to create an awareness as to how the global warming is actually impact our environment. He thought of doing a swim across North Pole where not even a single swimmer has ever reached. Forget about even getting into the water, but not even reached. Okay, and this is what he thought of. That was his first idea, that let's try this and explain to all the people how global warming is having a negative impact. He started training a year earlier before he planned his race. And in his story he's talking about where the weather conditions are absolutely in minus. He had to swim in minus 1.7 degrees where he was actually training. He's from South Africa. There the temperature is usually around 18 degrees or so, which is very normal for a swimmer to get into the water and swim. So he said, I had to actually work on two aspects. One, obviously, when it came to training into the cold water, because there they created that kind of an atmosphere where he's actually getting into 5 or 6 degrees Celsius water. Second thing, he also had to work on his mental toughness. What he mentioned in his video is that he worked so hard for a year, obviously in the water, but more so outside the water when it came to mental training, because first of all, the conditions were extremely tough. Swimming across North Pole where no human had ever entered the water. That's one. Second, swimming into that cold water where it was just black water around, where none of us as swimmers have ever experienced swimming in a black water. So there were certain challenges which he had to actually imagine or visualize and then get all of them into when he was doing his practice session. A year later, he actually touched the North Pole, and to his surprise, it was first of all an awesome experience for him. So before his actual swim, he tried doing a trial 2 days before. And he decided just to swim for 5 minutes and get that experience how it was. Unbelievably, when he entered the water, he said, I was gasping for air. I had completely become breathless. My body just couldn't move. And he had to swim just for 20 minutes, 1 kilometer race. But those first 5 minutes of that race, he was completely frozen. He started actually sinking into the water. His fingers, he just couldn't feel his fingers. Somehow he came to the shore, and his crews pulled him out. And he was so much into depression, and he knew that 2 days down the line, he had to actually complete this challenge of his, which he had accepted a year back. There were other members from his crew who actually went into counseling. They consoled him, they gave him that confidence, and 2 days later he came up with a complete confidence, a complete different approach, and he was so confident of himself that he said, I actually entered the water and I started feeling that feeling of achievement, that feeling of confidence, and I was completely into the zone. And whether it was 1 degrees or minus 1 degrees, it really didn't matter. So this was basically a story which I want to now connect when I'm talking about what are the parameters of mental toughness. So I'm sure you all can go on to the YouTube and listen to his TED talk. And after that race, he actually said that I took that oath that I will never ever swim in these cold conditions. But again, Lewis being Lewis, 1 year down the line, he heard of Mount Everest, and he actually went there to have his second swim, fleet out there, and he actually completed even that. So that is what we are talking about, mental toughness. So I want to go on to the next slide, and I'll cover all of these, or I'll link all of these mental toughness to his experience. Yeah, so this is basically, you can see all the icebergs behind him, and he's swimming into that condition and completing the race in 18 minutes, 50 seconds. Let me tell you all that when I discuss all of these attributes or what is mental toughness, the question that I ask my athletes or even the coaches or even the parents as to what what are the reasons when we actually go for the competitions, or when we go for our tournaments, what are the reasons that actually are connected to poor performance? And the answers that I usually get, which I've put some of the answers on the screen, is poor concentration, tough opponents, too many thoughts, got scared and nervous, was not confident at the time of a match, was thinking of winning and losing. And there is, we can go on into a big list actually, but I've just covered a few of them. And if you actually clearly see over here, all of them, and when I do workshops with coaches and parents, almost 95% of the answers that they give to me for this question, as to the reasons for lack of poor performance in the competitions, is mainly linked to the mind. And unfortunately, when these players go back into their training session after experiencing all of these negative thoughts, unfortunately, the players are again put onto rigorous training, physical training aspects, fitness training aspects, and the mental aspect is again completely ignored. So what I want to mention here is, most of the times our performance is impacted due to our mental aspects, but we still do not take efforts to actually improve on them. And that's where I feel I always talk about, I talk about the iceberg. What we see is, when players are performing, when athletes are performing in the competitions, they are completely around 80-85% ready when it comes to their physical aspects, when it comes to their fitness aspects. But I always say that tip of the iceberg, especially when it comes at the time of performance, is completely through your mind. And if that is not worked on, and if that aspect is not really taken care of, we will either see fluctuations in performance coming in, or we would see at times players are really doing well. In the second tournament, the performance keeps dropping. The third competition, maybe it is average. So these fluctuations that we see in the performance is because that last aspect, that tip of the iceberg that comes from mental training approach, is not really taken care of in your daily session. So I will obviously come on to the techniques what athletes can actually use on daily basis. Yes, so when I actually mentioned the story of this Lewis, so I'll connect all of the aspects of mental toughness over here. Lewis had an unshakable self-belief. He actually thought, when he decided to swim across North Pole or even Mount Everest, that was an unshakable self-belief. Not even once he thought that I won't be able to do it. Maybe when he entered the water, when he was doing his trial, yes, he went into depression for some time, but then his support staff actually helped him to get that self-belief back. So this is one of the most important aspects when we are talking about mental toughness, which is self-belief. The second one is resilience. Resilience, in short, or in simple terms, I would say that resilience meaning bouncing back from failures, from setbacks. So the trial actually made him realize that it was an extremely tough task for him to swim in that water, in that cold water, for 20 minutes. And at one moment he felt like giving up, but he immediately bounced back and he thought of continuing, because he actually could see the goal in front of him. Why was he swimming this race? So that is where we see resilience in Lewis. Another one is high motivation level. Now, why this high motivation level is because he always had that goal in front of him, because he was working as an environmentalist. He was working as, showing people what are the negative effects of global warming. So once that motivation is there, obviously you are driven to achieve that goal. So high motivation is obviously what we are seeing in Lewis. Focus under distractions and not getting affected by others, that's another parameter when we talk about mental toughness. So whatever distractions there are, and all of us as athletes, we have hundreds and thousands of distractions around us. We see our same age people enjoying, partying around, and we are the ones who are actually training day in and day out. So this also could be one of the factors which could distract you. And same thing happened with even Lewis. But again, coming back into and understanding what your focus and what your motivation and what your goal is actually will help you to reach, and that is what we call it as mental toughness. Another one, handling emotional and physical pain. Obviously, Lewis went into a lot of physical pain because he actually said that once he touched the water, his fingers actually swelled like sausages, and he could have no sensation in his fingers. Okay, there was emotional pain. Maybe at times he felt that, will I be able to complete my goal which I had set in front of me? But yes, again, coming back and making yourself realize why are you here is something where your ability to handle emotional and physical pain is one of the things which is again connected to mental toughness. And the last is handling anxiety and pressure. So all of us as athletes, all of us as players, it's unavoidable that we will not have anxiety or pressure. So mental toughness does not mean that you minus your anxieties and pressures, but mental toughness means how you can deal with anxieties and how you can deal with pressures. And that's the reason why we will be looking towards what could be the mental techniques which would help you to minimize and handle the anxieties and pressures. So what I've tried doing it here is I've taken one person's example and tried connecting it to all the parameters which are the most important ones when we are talking about mental toughness. So I always say that when we are talking about sports specifically, it's not only your physical skills, which maybe knowingly, unknowingly, we only think about when it comes to sports. We are all the time thinking about we have to do fitness training, we have to do maybe 3-4 hours of skill training, or at times even diet control or nutrition. But it's half of the story, I always say. The next part to it is obviously sport is it includes your mental skills as well. And what I mean by mental skills is not only at the time of your competition or your performance, because I have so many players and athletes coming in and saying that we try using our mental skills, and if I ask them when, they say when I'm on the ground. If it is for cricketers, they say when I'm there in the match, I start thinking how to build my confidence level. So obviously it's not something which comes at the last minute. It has to be ingrained, imbibed into your daily training. So we would also be looking at how mental skills can be a part of your physical skills, because I always say that whenever we are training, we're not keeping our mind aside. Okay, we are training our body, but our thought process, now mental skills or mental training is nothing else. In simple terms, it's your thought process. So it's not that when we are training we are keeping our mind aside. There are thoughts that are going on in our mind, but we try either knowingly to push those thoughts behind, or unknowingly we really don't know how it is really impacting our performance. So take advantage of your practice sessions, take advantage of your training sessions to identify how your thought process is working, because that's where the correction needs to be done. It should not be done when you are in the match or in the competition, but the correction needs to be done at that moment itself. So changing the thought process, knowing what skills to be used when you're changing your thought process, is what we call it as mental skills. When we talk about mental training, what is mental training? So I'll be also giving you certain examples, maybe certain stories also, so that I think the point that I'm planning to make is quite clear for all of you. So mental training is not something where the athletes are training only to win, because that is somewhere a misconception or myth which I've been hearing for last so many years. So athletes approach sports psychologists or mental trainers to win all the time. And I say that's a very, very difficult task, because none of the athletes for last so many years across any sport have always won. I give an example of Sachin Tendulkar. If you see his record, it's not that in every match he has scored a century. If you actually look at the statistics, more than the centuries, the number of times that he has got out on ducks is more. But that does not mean that he's not a good player and he's God for everybody. So mental training is not something where athletes have to win all the time, but I always say that it is an approach which is an excellence centered approach. So mental trainers train their athletes to become excellent in their skills or the techniques that you are using rather than having that winning centered approach. So one of the examples that I definitely want to quote here is our own Sindhu. When she went into Olympics, till the time she reached semis, her mental approach was, I am going to give my best. And that's how every step that she went ahead with, she actually played wonderfully well, and she actually started giving her best performance in every match. Unfortunately, when she came into the finals, her mindset was, I now want to get a gold for my country. Now here, if you see, uh, it's a very subtle message that we get here is, initially till semis, her approach was excellence centered approach, that I will give my best, I will focus on my techniques and skills, and I will try giving and reaching my potential. The moment she went into the finals, her approach shifted and it went on to the winning centered approach, and that's where at times we tend to lose focus. So mental training is something where, as mental trainers, we help you all to focus more on the excellence centered approach rather than the winning centered approach. Next one is helping athletes to reach his or her maximum potential and give the best. So this is what I always tell my coaches, my parents, and my athletes, is that if you reach your maximum potential, you are going closer to actually winning in the race. Yeah. If we have a direct focus on winning, we are losing out on the process. Okay, so if I'm a swimmer, if I'm only thinking about I want to win the race, I am actually coming under pressure and I am absorbing all those stresses because I'm only focusing on winning. With pressure and with tensions, I will definitely start committing mistakes in the small processes included in that swimming race, which would actually lead me at times to winning. So the processes would be maybe my start, maybe my underwater swim, maybe my kicking, maybe my pulling, maybe at times my turns. And once the pressure starts building, at one point of time, somewhere or the other, I am definitely going to commit a mistake because my focus is only on winning. And when mistakes start coming into picture, I am definitely going away from winning and achieving my goal. So let's have, in mental training, what we do is we are shifting the approach onto the process based approach so that you are increasing your chances to actually win the race. Okay. Third, it's not a quick fix solution. So mental training, obviously we don't I always say that when my athletes say that, the mental training is working in around maybe once I start coming to you, it has really started helping me and I've started winning the race. I always say that if it has really started working in next 10 to 15 days, it's going to be a temporary solution. So mental training does take a lot of time and it's not a quick fix solution. So for example, I have many parents at times coming and saying that my child has a competition maybe 10 to 12 days later and I want you to work on his or her mind. And most of the times I actually reject, because that's not something where it's a magic pill or a magic wand that you take it and you actually become confident and your concentration level is extremely high. So yes, all of us need to understand that it does take time, because all of us as players, when we are getting in touch with mental trainers, they go through a process. It's a 4-step process, and by the time the athletes are actually finishing that process, it's almost 3 to 4 months. Okay. The next one is, I've mentioned, one jersey does not fit all approach. So it's not one approach which actually, and this is especially for the parents and coaches, I want to stress on. It's not that one approach will actually, work for all the players or all the athletes. I would like to give again one of the examples. When I was into my swimming, that was, I would say, 30 years back, where mental training was was not in a picture at all. But my coach was such an open-minded person that he identified my skill area, my potential, and actually my capacity to train. Where other swimmers were training for 4 hours, 2 times a day, he actually identified that I am not a swimmer who can take that much of a burden. And he actually separated me from the group, and he knew that I can maybe just train once a day for 2 hours, and that's where I can give my best. If I'm asked to come back again in the evenings, I would be absolutely dead by the end of the day. So this is where I mean, one jersey does not fit all approach is the coaches or even the parents need to understand that every player is different. Every approach which has to be applicable to the athlete or the player is going to be different. And the last one is understanding the root cause. So it again drives down from the previous point that I have made, that every athlete, every player is different. Every athlete has a very different mind. Their emotional state is going to be different. Their psychological state is going to be different. So whatever their issues are or whatever their problems are that they are facing in training, it's very, very important that parents and coaches identify it and identify what's the root cause. If the parents or coaches are not able to do it, it's obviously the mental trainers. We have a different approach, first of all, to finding the root cause. We cannot say that, okay, you are tensed, just relax, just breathe, and your tension or your nervousness will just go away. So again, it's not that kind of an approach. Finding out what is the root cause, what actually is maybe troubling the athlete, so that the athlete is being more anxious or being more tense. One of the anecdotes maybe I would give you over here is I had one of the wrestlers, and I'm talking about an international level wrestler whom I was actually working with. And suddenly I started seeing a drop in her performance, and the coaches were really worried. The athlete herself was really worried as to what is happening. Now, as mental trainers, when I actually started working, I had to dig deep into her mind to find out why suddenly there was a drop in the performance. And when I started really working uh, very deep with her, I came to know that there were certain family issues and family matters that were disturbing her. So rather than telling her, do relaxation exercises, do breathing exercises, I actually had to come down one step and identify what was actually bothering her. So that's again a role of a mental trainer, I would say. So, as I have said, what are the things that mental trainers can really help you with? I also want to touch upon or put that light onto certain important mental aspects for our sport performance. Now, even me being a sport, having a sport background and working with athletes for such a long time, I would obviously give you certain examples and certain stories out here. So one of the major, as I said, I will not be able to cover all the parameters or aspects which come under mental training, but yes, I've actually taken a few which are extremely important for all of y'all as athletes and players. So one of the major important aspect or parameter what I feel in mental training, and that has an impact over athletes, is your belief. What we can also say, we talk about it we use this term very commonly or very loosely, which we say as self-confidence. So it's the most important aspect when it comes to performance, and that definitely helps a person to perform or not perform at the time of competition. So I've mentioned here it's self-belief and confidence from outside sources. So what do I mean by self-belief? It's your own ability, it's your own confidence within you, whether you can achieve a particular challenge or a particular task, as we saw in the first example itself. So Lewis believed in himself that yes, I can do it, I can achieve that impossible task, and that's where actually it helped him to drive that motivation within him to achieve that goal. So self-belief, I mean, I have given two sides over here for self-belief. So it's your belief. I would again would like to quote an example here. When I was reading a book on Rafa Nadal, the book is Rafa. So one of the incidences that he has mentioned out here is when, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's 2008 Wimbledon. And he was playing against Federer, one of the best known world number one tennis player. And just before the finals, Nadal had actually fractured his little finger. And that was the first time when he actually entered the finals of Wimbledon and playing against a great legend, that itself actually was causing a lot of pressure and a lot of expectations from Nadal. But that self-belief that yes, I am actually going to perform and do my best is what I talk about self-belief. And he played, the game went on for 5 hours. That was the final between Federer and Nadal, which went on for 5 hours. And in the book, Nadal has mentioned that initially, before the final started, I couldn't even hold the racket in my hand because I had fractured my small finger. It was becoming so difficult to even hold the racket. But the moment the finals started, for those 5 hours, he said, I had completely forgotten about the pain, that physical pain which it was causing me. And I was absolutely back to normal when I was holding the racket, and I played tremendously well into those finals because I kept telling myself that yes, I have to give my best, and I am going to try to give my best today. And ultimately the result was where Nadal defeated Federer in 2008, if I'm not mistaken. And then at the time of victory ceremony, Nadal couldn't even hold the trophy in his hands. But he had forgotten about this incident or this pain for 5 hours. And this is where I talk about self-belief, one of the best examples which I can think of when it comes to self-belief. So this is what I talk about when we mean by self-confidence or self-belief. Now, this self-belief is internal, but I also want to make a point out here where confidence also comes from outside sources. So we are always, all the time, as players, surrounded by coaches, parents. So it's also an important aspect how we can give that confidence to our athletes or players. And again, here I want to definitely quote one of the stories and my own story when I was a swimmer, when I was just 11 years old and entered my first nationals. And I had actually broken the record here itself when there was a state meet. I had broken the national record at that moment. But I was maybe just 10, 11 years old, and I was completely enjoying all that environment. I went for the nationals. In swimming, we have heats and finals. So in the heats, only 8 are selected and they go to the finals. I had broken in heats also. I broke the national record and went into the finals just 10 minutes before my race. There were two girls, I clearly still remember, there were two girls who came and approached me, and they said that, you've given a particular time and you've broken the record, but we were the ones who went very slowly in the heats, but now just see the finals, and we are actually going to crack the record and we are going to defeat you. And that's the moment, because it was my first national, my confidence actually shattered out there, and it was just 10 minutes before the race. Luckily, fortunately, I had my coach standing behind me and listening to this conversation. If he wouldn't have given that confidence to me, maybe I would have lost that national championship. But he immediately approached me and he said, whatever other people are telling you, I don't want you to really focus on them, but I want you to focus on what you can give your best at that moment. Forget about the record, forget about getting a trophy, but think about and keep telling yourself what at that moment, what you can do. So concentrate on the start that you take, concentrate on your strokes that you take, and whatever small bits and pieces that we've really worked on for last 1 year, just keep focusing on those. And that's, I think, where I got that confidence that my coach is with me. And finally, in the finals, I was the one who got a gold. I broke the national record out there, and that's it. So if I wouldn't have got that confidence from outside sources, I'm sure it would have been really difficult. So the second one, in mental aspects, what I always cover is preparation. Yes, all our athletes, all our players are working day in and day out. They are training extremely hard. They spend around 4 to 5 hours when it comes to physical preparation. There are 2 hours that they are into gym and fitness training. But yes, as I said earlier, the tip of the iceberg is the mental training aspect. And unless we actually mold it together in your training session itself, how much ever preparation that athlete or a player is doing on a daily basis, if mentally one thought at the time of tournament, what if I lose, will shatter everything, whatever efforts that you have put in on the physical front for last so many years. So preparation, mental as well as physical, is very, very important. The third aspect is being in present. And I think apart from self-confidence, this is very close to my heart. And I train my players, because basically mental training is something what we do as we talk about coming into the present and being into the present. So it's the process. What we always train our athletes is to think about the process and be in the present. So again, I would like to give an example out here what it means by being in the present. There was a snooker player called James Watana. He was, I think, from Malaysia. And one of the best examples, again, that suits here when we talk about being in present or process oriented. So when he had been with Geet Sethi and for his world championships, so he was playing his finals, and at that moment he was leading with his opponent, and he was extremely happy and doing really well, because this James Watana was just 16 years old. So he was really enjoying the entire attention that he was getting out there, and he was leading in the finals. Just maybe few minutes before they actually the finals would end, he started thinking about, and James Watana came from a very humble background. So he had seen this lane in Malaysia, and he always thought, because his mother was a house help, so he always thought that, when I start earning, when I start doing well in my snooker, this is the lane where I want to really purchase a house. A few minutes before the finals could end, he knew that now I'm almost leading and I am very close to winning. He actually went on to the future and started thinking about that lane, and how he had decided that once he starts earning, he wants to buy a house there. And it really doesn't take a lot of time to, your future to get changed. And that's where he actually crumpled, and he lost those finals. And he actually later on in the interview, when Geet Sethi was asking that, why, what happened to you? You were leading, and suddenly in few minutes we saw you actually coming back into the finals. I mean, just going or getting defeated. He said, my mind just started wandering. So Geet Sethi asked him, why didn't you bring it back? And he said, if I knew at that moment that if I'm thinking about future, that's going to be the end of my dream, I never would have done that. So that's one part of the story. So this actually tells us about how important it is to be into the present. The second part of the story is this James went and started training under a monk. He trained himself for next 5 years, and 5 years later he came back into his England championship. And that's where actually he was completely prepared, completely focused, and got trained as to how he needs to be onto the present. Same situation, he landed into the finals, and again, a few minutes before the final started, he got a message that his father has got shot dead, and it's okay even if he doesn't play the finals. He was asked to come back. At that moment he said, no, I want to play the finals. And he completely was in his zone of attention, what we call it in mental training. He played his finals, he won the finals, and then later on he collapsed. So this is what we see, two sides of being in present and not being in present, how it can have a major impact on the performance. The next is, of course, handling adversities. One of the major aspects I always tell my athletes that we need to be prepared for this. So be prepared, just start your preparation for what you really want to achieve, but your preparation also needs to go on to what if. So what if something wrong goes on? And as sports people, we need to prepare. So our preparation definitely is going on towards winning, towards doing well, towards really focusing on the race. But handling adversities is where I always tell my players is, you also imagine what ifs. here, especially when I talk about archery, because I work a lot with our Indian archers. So there are certain things in every sport which I always say that certain things which are outside our control. For archery, wind is outside their control, and it could be a major adversity, especially when archers are playing outside India, because there's tremendous amount of wind. When I was with them for their world championships in Netherlands, the wind was uncontrollable. When I was there with them for Asian championships in Thailand, uncontrollable wind. But if they wouldn't train their mind earlier how they can have or control this uncontrollable, it's going to be very, very difficult to handle that situation at that time. For example, I also quote Michael Phelps' example, who's our greatest Olympian in swimming. All of y'all, I'm sure all of y'all know. In 2008, if I'm not wrong, he was training for Olympics of 2008, and he was physically, fitness wise, completely prepared to achieve what he actually wanted to, where he wanted to break the record of Ian Thorpe of getting 7 individual gold medals in one Olympic. And he had set his dream of breaking that record in those Olympics. But there was one fear which went on to his mind for a very long time, that what if water seeps into my goggles? And that's obviously, as a swimmer, that's an adversity, and that's something which is outside our control. But if we don't identify what could be the adversities in your own sport, it's going to be very difficult to handle it at the last minute when you are faced with those adversities. So what Michael Phelps and his coach Bob did was, he actually, the coach trained Michael Phelps to swim without goggles and to count strokes. And unfortunately, what he didn't want to happen, it actually happened on the last day. Michael Phelps had equaled the record of 7 Olympic individual gold medals, and it was his last event, that was 200 butterfly, on the last day. You can imagine the expectations, his own expectations of others, loads of mental pressure on him, and also that slight worry about what if water seeps into his goggles. He took a dive, and slowly, after some time, one side of his goggles the water started seeping into his goggle. It's fine, at least he could see with one goggle. After the first turn, his both sides of the goggles got filled with water. But if he wouldn't have been preparing himself for the adversity, it would have been very, very extremely difficult for him to manage that condition at that moment. But the only thing his coach had prepared him for is how to handle that adversity at any moment which can come up. And that's how he relied completely on counting the strokes, and he became the first ever swimmer in the world to get 8 individual gold medals. And that's the best example. I mean, I cannot think of any other example when it comes to handling adversities, the best one being of Michael Phelps. So again, next point that we come on is aggression. Aggression, I would say, most of the times aggression is seen negatively when it comes to mental training, but it has both aspects to it when I talk about aggression. So we have 2 types of aggression. One is called hostile aggression, the other which is called instrumental aggression. So hostile aggression is something where you are being aggressive, and your whole and soul aim is to maybe trying and hurting your opponent, which is in no way going to actually help you as a player or as an athlete. Maybe it can help you. And one of the best examples, again, I would quote here, is of John McEnroe. I'm not sure how many of you all know, but years back when Boris Becker was there, it was his time where McEnroe was one of the best, maybe I would say world number 1 in tennis. Uh, McEnroe was a very, very aggressive player, a very hostile player, and he used to break his racket, he used to scream, he used to shout, he used to have arguments with the referee whenever he used to lose one point. Okay, but at no point of time we ever saw McEnroe losing the match or that anger or aggression affecting him. And the studies have actually gone into it as to why being so aggressive and being so hostile, how it has actually helped him in his game. The truth that came out is McEnroe was completely from within, mentally an extremely tough person. But what he used out here is a hostile aggression, where he wanted to break and make opponents lose and break their attention and their confidence and their concentration level. So when opponents started watching McEnroe throwing all these feats onto the court, they obviously got distracted. They obviously lost their control over the game, and that's where McEnroe started taking advantage of it. But this is what we call it as hostile aggression, and which obviously we don't want to get into, or try to be aggressive in a hostile manner. So what I say is the second side of aggression, which we call it as controlled aggression or instrumental aggression, is the definition maybe of instrumental aggression is how we can positively channelize our emotions, our negativities for our own performance, and trying to get the best out of it. Again, one of the best examples out here is of our own Indian cricketer and captain Virat Kohli, and it's a very, very recent example that has happened when West Indies team was here in 2019, and India was playing their series against West Indies, and there were Virat Kohli was not really getting along with few of the players from West Indies, and he actually wanted to prove his point. So we had, I think, 3 ODIs with West Indies, and it was a third one. 2 we had already won, and third were West Indies were completely into their zone and wanted to desperately win that. And Virat Kohli was on the ground, and we had lost quick wickets earlier. And Virat Kohli came with that aggression. He's always into that aggressive mode. He came with his aggression that, I'm going to show that we can definitely defeat West Indies. And he actually started hitting the balls. And at a point, he realized that he was actually, fortunately, he was missing and not getting out. And that's where he felt that this aggression is really not working, because his focus was only on winning and really defeating the West Indies. When he actually turned that aggression into himself, within himself, he thought of, for a few seconds, that is where he has said it in his interview, that he actually for a second he thought about what are his strength areas, what is that kind of an aggression that really helps him perform well in the matches. And he thought, my timing in the match is the best bet that I can actually start using, which will definitely lead India towards winning. And this one single thought in that 1 second had actually changed the game. His approach changed, the aggression changed, and the aggression actually became an instrumental aggression, where he could channelize his aggression into his game and helped India into winning, and he himself stayed not out for 94 runs. So that's where I always divide this aggression into 2 aspects. And I'm sure as athletes, we don't want to go on to the first part of aggression, which is hostile aggression. So we are always looking at instrumental aggression, which is going to help us, whether it's your team game, whether it is your individual game, it's always going to help us as athletes. Another aspect is emotion management. Emotion management is where I always say that whenever we are into sports, whenever we are into any kind of a game, we are going through a whole lot of emotions. We are going, it's a kind of a roller coaster of emotions. We are at times sad, we are at times happy, we are at times aggressive, we are at times disheartened. So all of these emotions, it's the impact of the competition or the tournament pressure that all of us are in. If as players and athletes, that's what we've been talking about earlier, if we don't have a kind of a plan of mental training techniques included in our training program, it is going to be very, very difficult to handle these emotions directly at the time of the tournament or matches. So emotion management, how you control, there are certain techniques which I would also be talking about in the next session. So it's going to be very important for all of us to work on emotion management, because it's going to be a part and parcel of our sport that we are actually in. Okay. So these are very, very important mental aspects that I always say that we as players need to work on. Yeah, so let's look at certain techniques as to how we can manage all of these aspects. So I'll just be touching upon certain techniques. Yeah, so these are certain mental training techniques, and I have named it as pre and post championship. So it's not something that we only need to do or practice these techniques just before the competitions or maybe only after your championships, but this is at both level. And the first and foremost over here is assessment. And unless, as I said, every person is different, every athlete is different, and it's very, very important for us to know what kind of a person I am, and only then as a mental trainer he or she can plan a kind of a program. So I get so many of the athletes, but even I have an entire Indian team of archery with me, but every player, every single player is different from the other. So unless I do any kind of an assessment, I would not know what exactly they need when it comes to mental training, and what is it that I really need to work on. So assessment is the first and foremost part when it comes to mental training. So in assessment, there are certain, I would say, standardized tests which only mental trainers can do, but which I'm talking about, which athletes can do themselves, is the second technique. What I'm talking about is performance profiling. And what do we mean by performance profiling, which is linked to the third aspect, which I'm talking about, need or gap analysis, is what in technical terms that we talk about. So performance analysis is where, as players, we need to identify ourselves as to where am I now, what's my current level of performance, whether it is in terms of your physical skills or in terms of your mental skills. And you also have to profile yourself and identify where do you want to reach, maybe 6 months down the line or 1 year down the line. Okay, and this is what I call it as a gap analysis. So 1 year down the line, where you want to reach, and currently where is your performance. And we'll obviously be seeing there is a kind of a gap. Unless we help ourselves to bridge that gap, it's going to be near to impossible to achieve the targets that we have set for ourselves. And if we don't work on this gap analysis, or we don't work on bridging this gap, we are always going to be left with a kind of one single sentence or question in our mind after every championship is, I did so hard, I worked so hard, what happened at the last minute? So the answer to this question is going to be in your gap analysis. So as players, you can have this performance profiling done at least once a month. That is what I encourage my athletes to do. Identify where you are right now, where you want to reach, maybe 6 months down the line, 1 year down the line. And then you have to have kind of progressive goals for yourself. Find out every month, where do I want to reach? So what we talked about, the process goals earlier, try and work on the process, on those building blocks, which will definitely take you and help you to reach the target. And this is what I mean by performance profiling and a gap analysis. So it's one of the best techniques which all we as mental trainers work on to identify and to work and bridge this gap for all the athletes. The next one which I talk about is self-talk, a very, very important technique, because self-talk is something, if I have to explain it, it is our dialogue on a regular basis that we have within ourselves. And if we really focus and concentrate on the kind of dialogues that we have throughout the day, I would say 90% of the talk that we have with ourselves goes on to a negative direction. Okay, so the things that we talk to ourselves, it has a direct impact on our feelings and emotions, and feelings and emotions have a direct impact on your actions. So if I'm feeling negative, if I am feeling under pressure, my emotions are going to be negative. If my emotions are going to be negative, I'm going to feel that pressure and anxiety, and that is going to get reflected in my action when I'm into any of the sport. So it becomes very important to go deep, dig deep into what your self-talk is. One of the important, I would say again, a story of um, about our tennis player, who's Djokovic. And it is the recent Wimbledon, that's 2019 Wimbledon, when he was playing the finals against, again, the legend, that's Federer. And the entire stadium was screaming because it was a tough match again, which went on for 5 hours, and the entire stadium was literally cheering for Federer. And we could, when I was watching that match, I could actually just I could just hear only one name, that was Federer, Federer, Federer. At one moment, this is again where Djokovic uh, has quoted in his interview. He said that at one point of time, I just could hear only one name, that was Federer, Federer, Federer. And I started coming under pressure that entire stadium is backing Federer. I am just the only person out here who's just supporting myself. And that backing for Federer was so great that at times it can lose, the opponent lose that focus, and maybe at times he could have lost the match as well. Self-talk over here, the example of self-talk that I want to give is Djokovic at that moment just controlled himself, and he said that I converted this talk and I started cheering myself and started screaming inside within myself, that my own voice was started screaming like Djokovic, Djokovic, Djokovic. So I started pepping up myself. I converted that cheering, and it actually helped me. And the result of this final, where Djokovic won and defeated again the legend, which was an impossible task. So self-talk is where you convert your negative self-talk into positive, and it's going to directly have a positive impact on your game. So there are certain ways, because there are certain different ways that you can convert your self-talk in, and that's one of the important mental training techniques that we use. Visualization, I would say at times visualization is the toughest and one of the best ways in mental training techniques to visualize your game. And there are two aspects when it comes to visualization. So I train my athletes to get into process visualization as well as your performance visualization, because there are certain things that we need to really take care of as to what you're doing in terms of your processes and your daily training techniques. So that is what I call it as process visualization. But you also have performance visualization, which is purely for your championships. And there are ways in which you go ahead by doing your visualization, but that's one of the best ways. And all our top athletes, all our legends are, whether you talk about Virat Kohli, whether you talk about Sachin Tendulkar, Dhoni, all of us make mention of visualization. Even Federer, even Nadal, if you read their autobiographies, they talk about visualization a lot, because when you reach at an elite level, you've almost worked on all the technical part of it. But if you're not into that visualization mode, it really doesn't help you. Next, along with visualization, I always talk about breathing techniques. And this is where, as I said earlier, it helps you to bring back your emotional control. There are different ways of doing your breathing techniques. Pranayam is one of the best ways which you can have control over your aggression, over your emotions, and that helps you to perform well in your championships. And the last but not the least, again, it's one of the most important technique, is goal setting. Unless you know what your destination is, it becomes very difficult to plan your process from now onwards. If I want to really get selected in the Olympics, maybe next year or in 2024, I need to have certain goals set for me. If you don't have those goals in front of you, you only see the destination, but the process is not in place. And that is somewhere, in spite of having all the potentials, can backfire on you because the process is not in place. So these are certain mental training techniques which I wanted to, mention it to all of you. And the last topic that we come on to is obviously for the coaches. I'm sure there are a few coaches who are listening to this, so I want to really touch upon that. This would be the last one, so I'll just touch upon in brief certain important aspects which are very, very crucial as coaches. So be self-aware and also help athletes to introspect. So what I mean by self-aware is your introspection and your self-reflection as a coach will help you as well as help your athletes, and in a way where there is going to be a great coach athlete relationship, because that's the ultimate thing that we are looking forward to. And when there is a positive coach athlete relationship, we see great amount of results, positive results coming out. So as coaches, they need to identify, maybe at times just take one step back and identify what your emotions are, what your intentions are, why have you got into this field, and whether you're really traveling to those intentions that you've really started your profession into. Once you're aware about your emotions, about your intentions, about your feelings, it is going to help when your interaction with the athletes is going to happen. So awareness for coaches and being aware with regards to athletes is going to be very important. The second point is try and make athletes independent. Now, why I have mentioned this point is because I work a lot with tennis, table tennis players, and even badminton players. And what I have seen out there, at least this will not happen when it comes to sailing, but on these on ground sport, all of these sport, they have a coach sitting behind them. And only when the coach is sitting behind, the athletes are able to really perform well. And I've heard so many times from my athletes that just because my coach was not sitting behind me, I lost the match, because they were not getting those constant instructions and guidelines from the coaches. So what I call it this as a learning cycle. So all coaches need to get into this or help athletes to be independent when it comes to the thinking process. So I always say that it's a kind of a learning cycle. So it is playing, then it is your thinking process, then it is your analysis, and then going back into implementing all of those into the matches or championships. So I'm sure when it comes to the group discussions, when coaches are having group discussions, make it very clear that, or ask questions, or maybe make the athletes very independent and take certain inputs from the athletes as well, so that you know whether the athlete or the player is having an independent thinking or whether the athlete is a lot dependent on the coaches. So that's one of the most important things from the coach's perspective. Next is identifying and cultivating a program, keeping in mind different styles of learning. Now, in psychology, since I'm first a psychologist and then a sports psychologist, we always talk about different learning styles. It is your visual learning style, it's your auditory learning style, it's your kinesthetic learning style. So one of the examples which again pertaining to me, when 30 years back, 35 years back, my coach identified that I am a visual learner. And what he did at that time is, see, it's very difficult um, to make your programs pertaining to each learning style. But as a coach, if you can identify all of these learning styles and have and develop a program suiting all the learning styles, I'm sure every athlete is going to be helped in this. So my coach identified that I'm a visual learner. What he tried doing is he got hold of certain video cassettes. At that time, there were video cassettes. Once a week, we all used to have a session which was a video session. So we used to see all of these techniques, because we still in India don't have underwater cameras. So at that time, he used to get these video cassettes. He used to make us show the underwater technique or different skills, maybe of freestyle or breaststroke, how your legs are moving, how your hands are moving. And once we actually caught that attention of how the skills were done in water, we could actually get it into our swimming. Otherwise, just by saying that keep your, bend your elbow or keep your feet straight, it really doesn't get absorbed if you are a visual learner unless you see it in front of you. So this is what I mean by being very sensitive to different learning styles of athletes. And the last one is, of course, be aware of various personality types. Now, as coaches, all of us know that we have different personalities of athletes around us. There are some who are extremely hyperactive. There are some who are introverted. There are some who are completely shy. So it's very important to develop again your program around all of these, and attending to each of your athlete depending on what their personality type is. So I think for coaches, yes, these are the four major areas I would say that coaches can really reflect on and start using in their program. Yeah, so I'm sure, I hope I'm not running out of the time.
Absolutely superb, Mugdha. That was so completely revealing, so much of stuff that we really need in the sport of.
Thanks. Yeah.
So much of information. It's unbelievable. We just crossed through about an hour, one of the most sizzling talks we've ever had. And we went through an hour without even realizing. You were just pouring out stuff. I was writing out questions, and every time I'd write out a question, the next slide would actually cover that question. So,
I'm sorry if I've actually crossed the time limit.
No, don't worry about that. We just absolutely enjoying this session. But let me ask you a few questions. And
Okay. Yes.
I was saying, every question I was writing down and asking, and you were covering it. It's just totally amazing.
Okay.
Thanks very much for being with us. But however, all this business of adversity and instrumental aggression and the city story, they were all really riveting. Even the Nadal and the Phelps and the Virat Kohli.
Yes.
Thanks very much. We talk about preparing athletes and sailors and archers for failure and visualizing that. How about this issue of preparing them for success? For example, you're at the right moment, at the right time, you're about to win, and you blow it up.
Yes.
So, can you talk about that?
This, I would say, it gets covered in the technique of visualization, which I have spoken about. And there is a visualization, that's what my creation is. It's a process visualization as well as a performance visualization. So what I always say is that obviously when we are preparing ourselves to win a tournament or win a championship, it's the process which helps you to reach there. So in your visualization, when it comes to performance visualization, you have to visualize your pre-game routine, because that's one I want to focus on. I think you've got it, which I mentioned about visualization process as well as performance. So it becomes extremely important, not at any point of time, not to shift your mind, and be careful that it is not shifting onto the future and not onto the podium.
Sure.
Yes.
The can you tell us about 3 successes or 2 successes which are basically where you actually rewired the mental aspects of athletes, which led to a winning situation?
Okay. One of the things which I would say, again, I wouldn't take the names, but since I'm working with our archery team, when I was there with them for the Asian Championships.
How much physical pain can be mitigated with mental power?
It's, I think, a very good question. But what happens is at times physical pain actually it takes you or overpowers your mental pain. So this is what I always say, that when it comes to your mental training, you always have to imagine even the worst things or even your pains. As I've given the example of Nadal when he was playing his finals in Wimbledon. So unless you train even to work on the pain, the physical pain is going to be very difficult for you to handle at that moment. And that's the point when you can cover in adversities. So imagine the adversities when I work with wrestlers. The most important adversities for them is injuries, because they get injured even in their training session every day. So all these combat sports, one of the major aspects that they need to work on is the injury aspect. So they need to overcome the fear of getting injured as well. So I'm sure when they get this into their mental training on a regular basis, imagine themselves getting hurt or getting injured and still overcoming that. That's one of the mental training techniques that we can groom athletes for.
It's all preemptive, and it's all to do with, I think, visualization. Thanks very much. In sailing, very often you have different varying weather conditions. You have sometimes extremely light wind, and you have extremely heavy wind. And some sailors are heavy and some sailors are light. So typically, it seems like as of the heavy wind sailors, which means the heavier sailors will do well in heavy wind and the lighter sailors will do well in light wind. Not entirely true, because I've seen the happen. So I want to know, how do you mentally prepare a heavy wind sailor who's heavy, has decided that light winds is not for him or her, and they are,
Okay.
yes, how do you prepare them for
Okay. Now, this is again, my approach here would be coming back onto, rather than making judgments, what could be the process, whether you are heavyweight or whether you are lightweight, what is it that's actually going to push you to that limits? So having the focus onto yourself rather than looking at how other people are and how I am, because that's going to lead to the first thing that gets impacted is your confidence when you're focusing onto the others. Okay, because we always put ourselves down when we are comparing ourselves with others. So here I would definitely say that athletes can actually look into themselves, identify what are their strength areas rather than focusing on the weaknesses. Okay, and whatever your controllables are, try working those out by building focus onto the strength area. So that's one of the strategies that the sailors can work on.
Sure, thanks. Sailing, they say very often, is like chess on water. There's a lot of strategy, there's a lot of tactics. You're going
Yes.
against the breeze in various directions, and you got to
Yeah.
judge. It's like chess on water. So, how does one sharpen the mind, given that a lot of sailors and athletes, most of the time is spent on training on the water skills and performance and endurance, etc.? How do you, what mental exercises or can you provide us?
Okay, I can see there are two things when it comes to sailing. One of the things is your concentration, your focus approach, keeping yourself calm, because the conditions are extreme when it comes to sailing, and they're not the same because there are varied conditions, and decision making is the most important aspect that they need to work on, especially the sailors. So the technique that I definitely think of for sailors, number one is visualization, where you visualize all of these positive as well as negative conditions and preparing yourself how you can work under those conditions. That's one. And secondly, also having control over the emotions. So your breathing techniques, in spite of being under those terrible conditions at times, how you can keep yourself calm, because once you're keeping yourself calm and low on pressure, I think your decisions are going to be better, because as sailors, as I know, that they need to get into quick decision making, they need to take certain decisions very very quickly. So once they are calm, it has an impact on better decision making skills. So visualization and breathing techniques are the ones on a regular basis, if they start working on, I'm sure that's the aspect which we can improve on.
Sure. Anything on pure sharpening of the mind, which means playing chess or just making your mind sharper and sharper and better?
Yes, one of the things, as I earlier I have mentioned, is making your mind sharp is, deciding on your strategies and techniques. So whatever the positive ways, whatever your strength areas are, which we already cover in goal setting, is identify your strength areas and how you can maintain those. And the second one is why your mind wanders or starts getting into the negative mode is we've never thought about, if at all I face certain adversities, how do I have to take control over? So your strength areas as well as your weaknesses, once you are very sure how your mind is going to start thinking in these two conditions, you're sharpening your mind and you're quick at your decision making at there and then. So if any of the negative things that are happening, what is it that you need to do at that moment.
Sure.
So unless you've trained it earlier, it becomes very difficult for everybody to handle that situation at that moment.
I can see the emphasis on visualization.
Yes.
What diet recommendations for mental fitness and supplementary recommendations? For example, physical, chemical imbalances, the impact of mental fitness, for example, on motivation, lethargy, distraction, ADHD, general emotional instability.
Yeah.
People often recommend vitamin D and stuff like that. So, what do you think should be the perfect or the recommended diet and supplement issues?
Okay. I'm actually not the right person to talk about diet, but I'm sure if there is, I always talk about 4 pillars when it comes to athletes' performance. And these are the coaches, these are the fitness trainers and strength conditioning coaches, mental trainers, as well as the nutritionists. So if athletes also get consultation from the nutritionist, because every person and every sailor is going to be different, I'm sure they will reach, when we are talking about the highest potential that they have to reach. I think all of these approaches coming together, they can definitely go ahead with that. But yes, nutrition, diet is one of the best things. So as I said, I'm not the right person to recommend what's the kind of diet that they need to take and what vitamins, but I'm sure the nutritionists are going to be better people to advise them.
Sure. You mentioned the importance of being in the moment. So, how do you train an athlete to be in the moment all the time?
Being in the moment is concentrating on the processes. So when I know, for example, I'm a swimmer, so I know what is the process that's going to help me come back into the present rather than driving me into the future. So for me, the processes are going to be my starts, my underwater kicking, my gliding underwater, breaking through the water when I'm out. So all of these processes, when I start thinking about, and when this record starts playing in my mind, I'm obviously going to stay in the present, and no way my mind is going to get traveled into the future or into the past. But this is, as I said, it has to become a habit every time they are into training. So for example, the conditions that they face, the training programs that they face, try and get your mind back onto the little processes that get into the performance.
How important is it
So
to have, sorry, I'm interrupting here, but how
yes,
important is it to have the second you watching the real you and constantly advising yourself, the self-advice,
yes,
having the
yes,
talk to
yes.
you?
Yeah, this is where where visualization comes into picture. So visualization basically is you are sitting at one place and you're actually imagining yourself maybe on the screen in front of you and doing the things which are required for you, maybe not the perfect ones but the positive ones that you're looking, the kind of positive skills that you are performing. So you're looking at the screen which is there in front of you in visualization, doing the things which are required. And also, if at all there are any negativities or certain issues that are cropping up, they can even visualize those negativities, turning them into positives. So visualization has that complete power to work on your mind completely.
So, while in performance, I mean, let's say in the middle of a badminton match, how important is it to have another part, another you watching yourself and advising?
Okay, so this is not actually recommended during your matches. So the visualization which I mentioned, it has to be done uh, in your training or just before the matches begin. So not at the time of your playing, because then again you're going to get distracted. So at that moment, I always say that when you have your mental training approaches practiced in your training, you are already on that autopilot mode. And this is what our main purpose of mental training should be, that our athletes should be on autopilot mode, where we are just not even thinking and concentrating on only execution of skills, because it's already been done and practiced for thousands of times earlier when you are into training. So our mode or our purpose of mental training is how athletes can go in terms of mental training on an autopilot mode.
Sure. Can you give us a few examples of how you dealt with your athletes failing and maybe even failing because of neglect?
As I was talking earlier for our archery team, because I'm handling our Indian archery team. So when I started working with them before the Asian Championships, because we were badly wanting to get qualified and wanting to get the Olympic quota. And that is where I actually started taking sessions as a team for archers, and also working on individual archers and resolving certain issues which were actually keeping them or pulling them back. So their focus was, which I identified and analyzed, was it was completely an external focus where, as I said, the anxiety was getting qualified and wanting to have a quota for Olympics, because this was, I think, the last chance, or maybe a second last chance to get qualified for the Olympics. So what I did with the team is, rather than shifting their focus onto getting qualified, what are the things that would help them to get qualified? Okay, so if you can actually understand the entire process, what I worked on is on themselves. What are their strength areas and how they can maintain those strength areas? There could be certain weaknesses and what we can do to improve those areas. So my complete program of 6 months with them, fortunately, it really worked well, and our both men and women team got qualified into we got the Olympic quotas. So that was, I think, a very recent example which I can actually give you all.
This is a negative question, and that is it important for, it's generally said that athletes to be deeply selfish and self-centered. And how do you, is it necessary to make them, understand that that's an important quality and still prevent them from going overboard?
Okay, so what I've understood is it beneficial and necessary to be more selfish, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I would say when it comes to sport, being selfish, I usually turn it into a positive mode where being selfish is thinking about yourself and bringing the focus onto yourself rather than thinking about your opponents. So if we can turn it and give it a kind of a positive connotation, so being selfish is not really negative when it comes to sports.
Sure.
So yeah, that would be my answer for it.
Is it common for athletes to collapse and drop from form after a major win? And how do you prolong them holding, if there is a series of championships, how do you prolong them staying in the zone and, and holding their mental focus across the series?
Yeah. Now this I see a lot with my cricket, because I do have our international cricketers with me since a very long time, and since their season is endless, I mean they're just playing series back one after the other, back to back. So at times they come to me like, there's just not a break, and I'm just not able to focus on every series that I'm playing. But what happens is, one of the things which I usually mention is the term concentration. And we have a very, I would say, a wrong belief about concentration, that even when players are playing 9 to 5 game like cricket, they're not supposed to be in that concentration zone for those many hours. And that's where I actually train, as mental trainers, I train my athletes to shift their concentration zones. So there are certain zones of concentration, which is a kind of a mental training technique which I work with. So how to switch on and how to switch off. So that goes on during their game, as well as it goes on once their series is over and moving ahead with the next series. So there are certain things which I do between the series, is where they have to take a complete mental break and not even think about how they have played earlier or how they would go ahead and play in the next series. Okay, now that involves a lot of effort, because physically you can stop playing, but mentally your mind still goes on. So filling your mind with certain other things and other skills that you're really good at will take your attention a little away from your sport, and that is a kind of relaxation, and it prevents you from breaking down and burning out. So these are certain techniques which I use with my athletes.
Thanks very much, Mugdha. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think I'm sure a lot of us now want to have you on board with us. I think the attention to detail and everything was by far a very, very spectacular session. Thanks very much. Have a great week, and
thanks
engaging with you more and more, both as a and otherwise. Thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you so much.